my slides up on the website?
Also, yes.
Yeah. Okay, let's get back to, right. I've got an agenda, but I won't go through it. You'll hear it as we go through. But basically, I'm going to wander through. I started playing in this game around about 1976, 77, 78. Before I got into it, it's worth saying that the linear opinion pool was well explored. Stone's 61 article was by no means the first that used it, I believe. And Kevin McConway did a lot of summaries of it later on. Howard Rafer talked about the problem in his lectures on decision analysis book. It actually is the cause that he and I met in the old days by letter and later in life by meeting up at, I think it was in Madrid. But he's got a bit in there about the independence preservation property, which didn't make quite sense. And later on, I wrote to him about it and we became friends through that. Bayesian ideas really came in, though, to the expert problem, not with Howard Rafer's asides in his book, but with P.A. Morris's papers in management science, and there's some references to it there. I wasn't convinced by Morris's work because it sort of has a view of calibration that doesn't accord with mine. But anyway, when you get the slides, all the references are down the bottom of the slides when you get there if you need them. Okay. I got into this in about 70, I think it was 78. Dennis Linney was giving a talk at UMIS just before they gave a paper to the Royal Stats Society, they being Dennis Linney, Amos Tversky and Rex Brown. It's a big paper which used a Bayesian three-stage model, the big thing in the 70s. If you didn't know it, my PhD was on it as well. But they used a three-stage model to impose probabilistic coherence on expert judgments. So you have a decision maker's prior of the unknown events starting out as your first stage. On top of that, you layer decision makers' judgments of the expert's knowledge. And on top of that, you have a third stage, which is a decision maker's assessment of the expert's ability at probability encoding. And you turn the Bayesian handles and answers drop out. Of course, in those days, the Bayesian handle was a normal linear three-stage model because there was nothing else. And you did it over log and odds so that you could have an infinite range and all of that. So I heard his seminar in 78 and it didn't quite make sense. It was making sense until you realize that if you had a load of experts who were sycophants and just yes men and agreed with the decision maker would get more and more and more confident, even though he learned nothing by talking to his experts. And I realized that as I crossed the road after the seminar, which sort of explains why I say it was a first encounter with SEJ in a bus, but the bus thankfully stopped. And I went back to work and started working on the idea of expert judgment, recognizing that there was a lot of dependencies floating around. Expert judgments are correlated by the virtue of their common science base, similar education, similar experience, including reading recent journals, conferences, and that sort of thing. But the decision maker may have done that. There are plenty of problems that we work with where the decision makers aren't ignorant peasants who listen to their experts. They know they're not uniquely expert in the topic, but they have a lot of knowledge. And so I was worried about that. And that led to a development of a lot of conceptual models, which I spent a lot of my early career on playing about with, just trying to explore what happened when the decision makers' priors correlated with the expert judgments and with other people involved, and the experts are correlated and all of that. And there's a whole string of papers you can explore there. That led me, or didn't lead me to, that influenced enough people that Dennis and Adrian Smith invited me to Valencia 2 where they asked me to give a paper on expert judgment, which I did, and I surveyed the field. There's an update that was given in 29, I think it was, in Madrid, but basically you can find out all what I said in those things. But I think the bit I contributed then, and I still think can be more valuable than sometimes is looked at, I came up with 3 problem types. The first one was a decision problem in which the decision maker is separate from the experts. So there's a real decision problem that can be modeled. The decision maker is responsible for that model and making the decision, but he takes advice from experts who have no responsibility for the decision. So you've got the focus of decision, but the experts don't have to worry about utility sides of anything else. They're just providing information and the decision maker takes it. Then you have a decision problem, perhaps more common, where you have a group of decision makers and they're jointly responsible for the problem, and it's their probabilities and utilities that drive the analysis. And the third one, which you don't have a problem. You just have a group of experts who are invited to write a report that will help deal with certain issues and undefined decisions out there. And if you look at those, it changes the way in each problem how you should think about them, or it does for me. This problem, the expert problem, is pretty much the common one in risk analysis. From a Bayesian perspective, and for those of you who don't know me, I was then a violent Bayesian. I'm now quite a Bayesian, but definitely a Bayesian. It means that the decision maker sees the experts as giving him data. The probabilities the experts announce are data for the decision maker. And that means he can do what he likes with the data. And one of the things you might want to do is to calibrate them, because experts are not perfect judges and they can be overconfident, underconfident, and all of those things. So there's an ethical approval, if you like, that the decision maker can calibrate them and even ignore them. And if you couldn't ignore the experts, Roger's classical method would have a lot of problems. But it's ethical. There's a good reason to think about why you might ignore some of them. The questions that really matter for non-Bayesians are: how do you choose the experts? How do you work with them? How do you elicit their judgments, and so on? And although the problem isn't entirely solved, this is the one we've made most progress on. It's one we do a lot of work on and we know a lot about. But when we turn to the group problem, it's not quite so clear. Although it's really important, because most, I've called them auditable decisions, but decisions where you're going to do an analysis and that analysis may become public and it will justify a big decision like what you're going to do about climate change or whatever like that. Those auditable decisions are made by groups. And within those groups, a group member's probabilities or uncertainties are her assessments, but to others in the group, they're data. So she has probabilities, but the other members see them as data, and that leads you into a whole discussion of Bayesian conversations or other conversations, which may be useful. But once you get into that position, it's hard to take an ethical position which allows calibration of their probabilities, adjustments. And certainly you can't ignore individual decision makers. It's not what we call democratic. It doesn't feel right. So whatever we use to solve the expert problem may not transfer across to here. And you get worse things, because Arrow pointed out that there's no helpful solution to that, certainly none that's rational and Bayesian. And lots of other people pointed out there's a lot of issues that individual members can manipulate and horse trade and be dishonest to get the result they want. And in fact, you can show more or less any group structure will encourage dishonesty rather than discourage it. And from that, you get to the sort of view, in my opinion, that groups are not decision-making entities, they're social processes. They're things that convert the individual judgments and decisions and votes, if you like, of the members of the group into some course of action. And when you start taking that, although we know a lot about how to do decision conferencing, or Tony O'Hagan's version of the Sheffield method, if you like, for working with experts, the whole issues are still far from solved. Yet, there's much naive and wrong software available to the public. If you look on your average phone these days, you can find a device that will allow people to call in free of charge and take votes, and you'll get to a rational solution, folks. We know it can't exist, but nonetheless, your phone can do it for you. So I think there's a big problem there that maybe we're not addressing as much. The textbook problem, I came up with it in 74, whatever it was, without any real clarity about it. If you look at my paper, I hardly discussed it. Tony O'Hagan, who was one of the discussants, did ask, does it really exist? And I think for decades, nobody really came up with a justification that it did exist, except you can write down conceptually it did. But then it starts to come up, because nowadays we have a lot of SEJ studies out there, and there's a possibility of reusing those, which brings up questions about how do we report them so they can be reused. The web, social media is really facilitating the reuse of those studies. They've been out there for some time, so we might want to update them, and there's going to be new data, but there's also a hell of a lot of alternative facts that back in the 70s, I don't think any of us worried about facts available to the public that they will believe that were completely false, but such alternative facts are out there today, whichever side of the fact you're on, you know. And even worse, we have out there on the web plug-it-in computation tools from R upwards, but basically web pages where you can go to, pull in a few bits of consequence code you dreamt up or grabbed from somewhere, pull in some judgment studies, bang them together with some data, turn the handle and walk off with an answer without any intelligent analyst ever being near you. And that worries me quite considerably. So I think there is, for the expert, the textbook problem, are questions about how you're going to do method reporting and reuse of SEJ studies, and maybe a methodology of meta-analyses is needed, just as you've got a methodology of meta-analysis of empirical studies. And there's a reference there where I sort of go through that sometime. Okay, that was what I was busy doing. But of course, the real developments in those days and things that were changing the world of SEJ was coming from Roger and his group, the classical models. And I was really lucky in the mid-80s. Roger came over to Manchester and introduced me to the Delft group and everything else. And I spent many happy days over in Delft. In particular, there was a big project. It was driven by the Cerveso directive to try and reduce or handle risk analyses of really complex risk problems. And Roger and his group, particularly Louis Hussens, who also led it, I think it was joint between Roger and Louis, they looked at how you could bring in expert judgments to do major risk analyses. It was an application-led project, which was nice. There were 4 major case studies in there, though there was a lot of literature review, a lot of developments and everything else. They developed the classical model, and they didn't just do it sorry, Roger, in those days, the mathematics was unintelligible. I remember reading your paper, and it was not easy, let's say. But you didn't just develop the maths. The whole group looked at elicitation processes, reporting guidelines and everything else. And it was very process-led. And it came up with sort of, it's really worth looking at this, that SEJ can do a lot of good things. And that led to a 2-year group set up by the European Safety and Reliability Research and Development Association, ESRDA, a big report, well, not big, 40-page report perhaps, on expert judgment and what was known, not just from the Delft project, but from GSF. There was some place in the AEA, was it in the UK, had done something. It brought in the TNO groups and all of that. There was a lot going on in that report. And I look back at it a couple of years ago. Not much that has happened since then wasn't in that report. It may have got more complex, but it did do quite a lot of good things. And of course, like all good reports, it exists on my shelf, Roger's shelf, and possibly 3 or 4 other people's, and is otherwise lost. 91, Roger published his book. And then, and I'm not sure of the dates because there was a lot of political argy-barging about startup and everything else. But there was a big project of the EU framework groups in the UK and the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Was a big project looking at doing expert judgment for probabilistic safety studies of nuclear reactors. And it looked at various types of model that you needed to use, from meteorological through to source term and dispersion. And it looked at how expert judgment would be made. It used the classical model in the UK and various other models in the US. It compared them. It did an awful lot of basic work. And it was, to my mind, a really important project that led to a lot of good results. And the result of all of this is that by 2000, the process for applying subjective expert judgment in risk analysis was laid out. And moreover, there was a whole emphasis on validation in this lot of work, which carried forward in future projects. So although it looks mathematical and everything else, there was a lot of process work that carried forward. I think that's important too. And if you look at the applications since then, well, there have been umpteen applications that come from linear weighted opinion pools, equally weighted, mostly unacknowledged. There's been a very few Bayesian applications, mainly led by Bob Winkler and his groups. The classical model was motivated by applications. We said there's now at least 200 reported and archived applications in a database, which was at TU Delft. I'm not sure if it's there still or RFF or just on Roger's server, but there's a lot of past examples which can be used and past data to test new methods. I sometimes wonder if it would be good to look at, now we've got that number, we must know the outturn of some of the risk events, and it would be quite good to start calibrating our methods by looking outside. By and large, that database has been looked at for internal consistency. And European Food and Safety Authority has adopted SEJ as a standard procedure. And we had a huge project led by Tim Bedford, a cost project looking at expert judgment across Europe and wider in many, many different application areas. My own topic, Bayesian analysis, well, that's been used for the expert problem. The catch is when you use it, you've got this lovely Bayes theorem. It's very simple. You can state at any time. The posterior probability for the decision maker on the thing you're interested in, given the expert judgments, depends only on the probability the decision maker has for the expert judgments given the thing you're interested in, and his prior probability for the thing you're interested in. It's dead easy, except there's this horrible thing that in there's a huge correlation matrix. Oh, there's a representation of correlation where it's driven by the fact that experts are correlated in their judgment. They're driven by social pressures, conflicts of interest, and so on. They're poorly calibrated. How on earth are you going to build that thing? If you're not a Bayesian, you may not even ask the question. And the linear opinion poll people don't. But we do. And once you start asking it, you throw your head up in fear and you can't do anything. Rafer and Morris's early stuff didn't think of it. Lindley, Tversky and Brown started doing it, but they didn't really get to the correlations properly. I played with conceptually things, but didn't get anywhere. Winkler and his co-workers got a bit further, but it was a bit sort of, we'll have that number, rather than getting into the correlations. You get to Albert et al. In 2012 in Bayesian analysis, who start to do a lot of work on a much more sophisticated Bayesian approach. I did some early work with Mike Wiper, which got some way towards it, but didn't do any better. Well, the real thing that killed it was we got slightly worse answers than Roger's classical model, and we took an hour on a mainframe, and he took 2 seconds on a IBM PC-AT on his desk. It just wouldn't calculate. The inverting things was too horrible. More recently, David Hartley and I have worked on a much more complex model. Sorry, that's unfair. David has worked on a much more complex model, and I've been the rather tired supervisor of his PhD saying, try this and letting him do it. But David got a lot further by combining Albert's work, some of the work on calibration from the States and so on. And he developed a model that works with the same data as the classical model. And I don't want to go into any detail here. I'm hoping we might get David to give a talk later in this series. But the results are remarkably similar to, and not far behind in quality, to the classical model. You can argue they're better, you can argue they're worse. I'd say they're very marginally worse. They're unimodal always. This is for one data set. This is a prediction from the Bayesian model. That's based on the same seed variables as these two. This one is the performance weighting classical model, and this one's just equally weighted. And typically, our models have to be unimodal. So that may or may not be an advantage, but they are certainly always going to be broader support. And I've always felt, particularly when the classical model throws away 4 or 5 experts, that the support shrinks in too much. And that may be of a concern, but our model gives that. The other advantage it has is because it's built on a multi-stage model, you can break down the post hoc analysis in many ways to look at different behaviors and to see how different correlations are arising, being used, and so on. So I think it's got a lot of possibilities, still needs development. I've retired and David is working hard in GSF and also just about to take long-term paternity leave. So I can't see much happening shortly, but there's something in there I think might be worth following up. Okay, that's my 40 years, and I don't think there's much in there that you won't know, but it may have set the balance for or background for the next few talks in this series. What I want to leave you with in the next 10-15 minutes, before we have a wide discussion, is a question. Have we been solving only part of the problem? Are we looking too narrowly at what goes on? So let me give you an outline of the analytical process. Problem owners perceive a risk, rock on a field, about to fall to them. They go to an analyst and say, can you help us do a risk analysis? Now, as a quick aside, Roger, when did you start modeling for Microsoft clip art? But ignoring that, the analyst will quietly build some sort of risk model. He then goes to experts, consults them for parameters or better observables for the model. He takes those results back to the model and he advises the problem owners how to manage the risk, and they run away or whatever. Okay, that is a cartoon, but it's not far short of what we do, except it's not. What actually happens in a lot of cases is not that, but the analyst goes to a group of modelers to pull in lots of ideas to build the overall risk model. So he or she works with experts to build the outline model, the risk model, with consequence models built in and everything else, and complex probability distributional shapes built in, and then he consults often further completely different experts to get hold of the numerical bits he needs to put in here, and then he does the analysis and off you go. They're different groups, but whatever we say about groups here, we ought to be saying about here. Whatever calibration is here, there's something maybe like calibration over there. There's certainly biases, the social pressures, they're different and all of that. So there's something going on that we may have a new combination problem. As I said, different experts, how should their views on modeling be combined? What about heuristics, biases and calibrations when expressed about the shape of a model, not the numbers that go into it? Processes usually distinguish between the qualitative form of models and the quantitative parameters, as if models and their parameters are completely different entities. But they're not quite that simple. There's no real qualitative There's no real qualitative quantitative divide. In a simple model, if we take a sort of two-dimensional model here, you might have parameter beta, but you can make that model more complex. You can put in further effects and everything else, and that beta may actually correspond with an average value or a certain output of a submodel. And in fact, measurement theory, a subject that was popular in the 70s and 80s, has died away, but tells us quantification depends on, or reflects qualitative representations in the system, but simply does so more precisely. There's no dichotomy, there's a gradual gradation of increasing precision. So we should not see eliciting model structure as different from eliciting numerical quantities. They're part of the same process, and yet we often separate them. So I've been arguing the last paper, perhaps the last one I'll ever write, but the last paper I wrote argued very strongly that we shouldn't talk about soft elicitation, or soft modeling, soft systems, model building, where you're worrying about the entities, cause and effect behaviors, uncertainties and preferences, building those into a model structure, and then getting to quantitative assessments of physical parameters, probabilities, utilities, computational parameters. We should see that as one whole process. And what's happened is we find this is well discussed in the risk, decision and structured expert judgment literature. There's huge discussions of that. This end, far less. In OR, you talk about soft OR and problem structuring methods. In information systems, you talk about soft systems. In risk analysis, you talk about hazard identification. In knowledge management, you talk about knowledge elicitation. And I can go on. You can go into design methods. All of these have got little ways of working with people to get hold of what the shape of a model should be, except all these little ways aren't the same things labeled differently. There's lots of different ideas and we don't actually compare across literatures. So I think there's two issues going on in here. Firstly, we need to really look at that end a lot better. And I should say, in model building, how many maths courses have you guys been on that have actually talked about how to build a model? The model comes in through the front door and you actually worry about how to analyze a model, but building it is not taught very much in mathematics. So first of all, I think we've got a lot to do up there. And secondly, I think, although I've got two ellipses here, we ought to see this as a much more continuous process. And in terms of experts, worry about how expertise moves up this process. Furthermore, physical models are seldom unique. The same, even if you take the same algebraic model, it gets embedded differently in different computer codes. It's approximated differently inside those computer codes. There are parameter judgments made by the computer technicians, the programmers, that decide how often a loop will happen and things like that, and which way you structure the loops that may lead to different results. And if you've worked with the meteorological industry, you can be really surprised at how different the outputs can be when arguably the same differential equations are lying at the heart is what's being analysed inside their different codes. So that's just one model, but then you would chain together lots of different models in most big risk analyses. You have things that tell you about dispersion, things that tell you about soil uptake, things that tell you about health effects, things that tell you about effects on agriculture. And when you're putting together those models, different experts lean and grab different models because their mate down the coffee bar said this one was good or whatever. And so different experts have experienced different behaviors and errors in the outputs of their models. Computer codes, parameters, and prediction areas depend on each other very closely, and we don't really explore that bit in doing our risk analyses. So the expert and knowledge encoded in the model needs to be fully compatible with the expertise and knowledge encoded in the parameters. And that's one. I'm coming to 2 more slides, so I think it is. We ask experts for their knowledge to reduce uncertainty, but we have to remember that some uncertainty remains. Even once you've built this model and you've got the things, you've got modeling uncertainty. You can talk about residual uncertainty from hard elicitation conditional on the model, but what about residual uncertainty from the soft elicitation of the model itself? And if you look in the stats literature, there's been a long discussion about model uncertainty. Reification is a term that Mike Goldstein's brought in and lots of other things, but it's come to no hard conclusions. And there's still the question out, how do we validate, calibrate, and deal with this soft uncertainty from elicited models? If a process elicits models and parameters, then we have a problem. Only the judgmental uncertainty on the parameters is being assessed. The uncertainty in elicitations of the modeling is forgotten. If we follow the best advice of eliciting not parameters, but observables, and then backfit the models, it looks as if we're picking up the overall uncertainty, but we're keeping the model fixed. So we're sort of squeezing or twisting the model to take up the best fit to the expert judgments, but all the parameters are doing all the work and the model's not bending at all. And that means we're not really getting a handle on the uncertainty. So, conclusions for our discussion. Firstly, it's not my problem, I'm retired. You guys can do it. But if I was starting out now and looking at the literature, I'd have 2 objectives. I want to understand fully where expertise and knowledge enter that process. We talk about uncertainty, we want expertise and knowledge. But on the uncertainty, I want to understand how you understand the uncertainties and calibrate them along the whole of that process. So I think the question I'm leaving with you is, are we getting a full handle on the uncertainties? And could we do better? So thank you. And if you want to read an awful lot of ideas, Tina and I and Tim, along with Annika, and I don't think she's turned up, it's late over there in Australia, edited a book which came out recently, and it's got an awful lot of summaries and things like this that will take you through it. Okay, over to you, Tina.